I believe that every bit of the Bible is just as God wants it to be. But there are portions of the Bible that evangelicals will consistently sweep under the rug because these portions don't fit in with their concept of what an inspired Bible ought to be. Well, what is it they're sweeping under the rug? By the end of this video, you will understand what it is and why I, and a whole lot of other Christians throughout the centuries, think should be out in the open. What am I speaking about? I'm speaking about the contradictions and discrepancies that are present throughout the Bible. And there's no way so many contradictions and discrepancies wouldn't be present in the Bible if God didn't want them to be there, if God really is behind giving us the Bible. For example, the Jesus that is presented in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is really very different from the Jesus we find in John. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what we often call the synoptic gospels, Jesus becomes aware more and more of his presence and of his divinity. But in the Gospel of John, he is very strongly aware of his divinity and utilizes it in his ministry from the very beginning. The Jesus in the synoptic gospels always teaches in short parables, illustrations from daily life. But the Jesus in the Gospel of John goes into long discourses, often without a lot of illustration. In the Gospel of John, the temple is cleared by Jesus early in his ministry. But in the synoptic gospels, the temple is cleared late in Jesus' ministry, and it really contributes to the people wanting to kill him. In Matthew and Luke, the birth stories that are offered are very different. We often mesh these together with the shepherds from Luke and the wise men from Matthew, but if you read them separately, you realize they're very different stories. Matthew seems to assume that Joseph and Mary have always lived in Bethlehem, whereas Luke assumes that their hometown is really Nazareth. There are all sorts of other things, and these are only brief examples, the tip of the iceberg. If you'd want a fuller list, you ought to check out Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Interrupted, or his blog, his video blog, which is entitled Misquoting Jesus. Bart Ehrman is an excellent historian, and although I disagree with him on a few things, most notably, he's an agnostic and I'm a believer. He is one of the best historians you can go to understand the history behind the scriptures. Well, evangelicals are uncomfortable with these discrepancies and contradictions because they think that the Bible's message ought to be true to the Bible's having all of its ducks in a row. But the Bible challenges such human concepts of truth and says that God speaks most clearly through human weakness. Only then does it become clear that God is speaking and not just humans making the whole thing up. For example, when God calls people in the Hebrew Bible, he often calls people that are not who you would think would be the ones to carry the message. They don't even think so. When God called Moses, Moses says, well, I'm not a good speaker. And God says, I'll take care of that. I'll give you Aaron to speak for you. And then he says, well, they don't know you that well. They don't know your name. God tells him God's name. And then finally, when he runs out of excuses, Moses just said, oh, will you please get someone else to do it? I mean, that's not exactly a heroic inerrancy type approach to speaking for God. But that's the kind of person God chose. When God called Jeremiah, he said, I'm not a good speaker. Sound familiar? And then he said, I'm too young. I'm not ready for this kind of thing. God reassured him that his weakness would make God's message clear. When God called Jonah, Jonah simply ran away. And when God finally got Jonah to preach to Jonah's enemies, the Ninevites, and they repented, Jonah would sit and be bitter about the whole thing. And when God decided to become incarnate in a human being, he picked a poor person in a part of the world that was not famous for its great speeches and great communication. And at the very center of the story of Jesus is God dwelling perfectly with a human being through suffering and through death. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapters 1 and 2 talks about how the world received this. He said this was considered a huge contradiction at the very center of the gospel message. In fact, you could argue that the Greeks calling the cross foolishness and many Jewish people thinking that it was wrong and inconsistent with the whole biblical idea of a Messiah corresponds to our inerrancy debates today. The failure of the people of that time to recognize God's wisdom in the cross is very similar to our leaning on inerrancy today. The Apostle Paul was very clear that the cross was a different kind of wisdom brought to the world that challenged human standards of what God's speech ought to be like. Paul himself was called when he was a persecutor of Christians, and then he became persecuted. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and 12, he lists all the problems he had and how people complained that he wasn't a good speaker. Sound familiar again? And then Paul said that even though he had received some remarkable revelations from Jesus, he also had a thorn in the flesh, a physical problem that made things very difficult and painful for him. Paul says he begged Jesus 3 times to take it away. And it's interesting to read Jesus' response, which Paul records. Jesus said, "My grace," or you could read, "my love, is sufficient for you, for my power is strongest when you are weak." The point is that weakness points us away from the possibility that humans could have accomplished it. Weakness pulls us away from reliance on ourselves, on our own standards, or on human standards of what is true and what can be. And when weakness wipes away these things and our pride, our blindness to God's wisdom, then it opens the door so that the kind of love we see at the cross can come in and give us a whole new standard for what truth is. Yes, the Bible's contradictions and discrepancies are there on purpose. God wants them to be there because they are an important part of God's message of love to us. Because when you admit errors on the human side, that's when love becomes most clear. No, the Bible doesn't want its ducks in a row, because that way it can speak to people like myself who don't have their ducks in a row. I am a person full of error, full of flaws and mistakes. I need a Bible that understands flaws, understands errors, and points me to something very, very different. If you have comments, please share them at the comment section below. God bless you all.